Hi, today I'm gonna recite Palace of Illusions for you all. I hope you like my video, and if you do, please do subscribe to my YouTube channel and share this video with all your friends. So, let's get started. Chapter 42 Snow. I stood under the archway of the main gates, its old stones, and gazed back at Hastinapur one last time in farewell. Its tree-lined avenues shimmered in the haze like the scene out of a dream. Twice before I left the city, how different it had been each time. The first one was as a naive bride whose heart strained after all the things she wanted: adventure, love, queenship, a palace to call her own. I made sure to wear my finest clothes and all the gold I owned so that the eyes of the onlookers would be dazzled. I held tight to the side of the elaborate, impractical chariot Dhritarashtra had given us to hide my nervousness. For I wanted the people of the city to remember me as heroic, majestic, the woman around whom history would gather itself. I wanted them to make up stories about the beautiful Panchaali, to weep because I was leaving them for something better. The second time I was on foot, clad in the rough garments a servant might wear. My hair hung loose about my face, already snarling. I no longer possessed any jewelry. My husband had lost it all at dice, but my eyes glittered like diamonds. My face was hard with hate and remembrance. Hadn't I possessed the most beautiful palace in the world, which Duryodhan had wrested from us by trickery? I lifted my chin high. I wanted the people of the city to remember the way I'd been humiliated, the curse I had pronounced. I wanted them to cower under my slashing gaze, knowing that subjects must ultimately pay for the sins of the rulers. But today, like my husband's, I was clad in beaten tree bark, attire of those who have renounced worldly life. I wore no gold. I had given all my jewelry away. Indeed, beyond what I wore, I possessed nothing. Behind me, Parikshit wept, and his new wife, and Uttara and Subhadra, and further behind, as I had once so bitterly wished. I heard the laments of the people of Hastinapur, their sorrow at losing us, but I no longer required their tears. It baffled me that as a younger woman I thought such a thing would make me happy. Now I wanted nothing, not even from Parikshit, whom I'd come to love more than I'd ever loved my sons. I sent a good thought toward the city, but I felt oddly detached from it, from all that had been my life until now. I was struck, suddenly, by how brief that life was compared to everything around me. The marble buildings, the flowering flame blossom trees, the cobblestone smoothened by the generations of feet, the indigo haze of the distant mountains. Perhaps this was how Kunti had felt, like a tiny boat rocking unmoored on the shore of a huge ocean, as she waited with vague interest to see where the current would take her. There was an unexpected freedom in finding out that one wasn't as important as one had always assumed. But as I stepped beyond the gateway, a traitor wind brought me the scent of parijats, that the old smell out of my garden in the Palace of Illusions, and with it a great regret. Why hadn't I planted it here in Hastinapur, like the firework stars that the court magician had ignited on the night of Parikshit's coronation? That single regret exploded in my heart, filling it with showers of burning sparks. I wasn't ready to let go of my life. How amazing it seemed to me with its victories, its adventures, its moment of glory. Even the shame that had struck like hot iron, branding revenge into my brain, seemed suddenly precious in its uniqueness. I wanted to live it all again, with more wisdom this time. I wanted to put my hand on Yudhishthir's arm and ask him to wait another year, a month, even one day. I hadn't taught Parikshit's wife how to make mango pickles with the secret ingredient that would keep them fresh for a decade. I hadn't condemned Uttara on the strength she had grown into. I hadn't asked Subhadra's forgiveness for the many ways in which I had tormented her. And Parikshit, how much there was to tell him. I should have confessed to him all the mistakes I'd made that I didn't want him to repeat. I should have disobeyed Vyasa and warned him of the dangers that lurked in his future. But it was too late. Already, Yudhishthir strode ahead, his face still as glass, my other husbands following him, steadfast as they had all their lives. Even then, I could have changed my mind. They'd all asked me to stay back. Parikshit claimed he needed me to guide him, especially when my husband's gone. The woman wept, saying that they would miss me. Why did I have to go? They demanded. If it was a religious life I wanted, I could live it right here in Hastinapur. Didn't they have temples and priests? Wasn't every holy festival royally celebrated in this city? Didn't the most famous sages visit us regularly? My husbands, too, asked me to remain. They feared for my safety. The path they were to follow up into the secret recess of Himvan was too treacherous. No woman had ever attempted it. If I fell by the roadside, Yudhishthir warned me, my husbands could not stop to help me. Such was the implacable law of this final journey they had chosen to undertake. The more people dissuaded me, the more determined I became. Perhaps that has always been my problem, to rebel against the boundaries society has prescribed for women. But what was the alternative? To sit among bent grandmothers, gossiping and complaining, chewing on mashed betel leaves with toothless gums as I waited for death? Intolerable. I would rather perish on the mountain. It would be sudden and clean, an end worthy of Bard's song, my last victory over the other wives. She was the only consort that dared accompany the Pandavas on his final, fearsome adventure. When she fell, she did not weep, but only raised her hand in brave farewell. How could I resist it? The sages guided us to the base of Himalayas. There they left us, for only a person who had given up the world forever was allowed to embark on the road that stretched ahead. We knew little about it, except its name, which seemed ominous, though Yudhishthir repeated it with relish, Mahaprasthanam, the path of the great departure. We had no idea of what it held. Even Arjun, the most widely travelled of my husbands, had not come this way before. The sages had told us that the road ended upon a sacred peak, a palace where earth met the abode of the gods. There, a man who was pure enough could push past the veil that separated the worlds and enter the heaven. The scriptures declared it to be the most glorious of experiences, but those who were not as holy, the sages warned, would be prevented from proceeding beyond a certain point. The mountain would make sure of that. With melancholy relish, they described avalanches and hidden craters, man-eating snow beads. When we heard of the evil that could be crossed, Yudhishthir's eyes sparkled with an interest I hadn't seen in them for a long time. I knew what he wanted, to enter heaven in human flesh. It was the latest of the impractical goals he'd run after all his life. With us in tow, I wanted to point out that we were dressed filmsily in clothing made of bark. Our feet were bare. We carried no food, as was the custom when one embarked on Mahaprasthan. We had no means to protect ourselves should the snow beast happen to be real. Yudhishthir had declared that weapons were a sign of ego and persuaded my other husbands to lay them down. It was clear that we wouldn't last long enough to reach any peak, sacred or otherwise. That did not worry me too much. I had accepted that we would probably die on the mountain. An end by freezing, I heard, was less painful than some others and not too different from floating into sleep. But what I resented was this. When we fell, our failure would be ascribed not to a physical limitation, but a moral one. The path was narrow and untraveled, cluttered with sharp rocks, and choked with snow and slush. Not too many people, it seemed, were desirous of leaving the world behind. In few hours, my feet were lacerated, though because of the cold they didn't bleed, nor did they hurt much. Already I had begun to lose sensation in my feet, but my other senses were heightened. I had never been for one appreciating the wilderness, preferring the shaped and contained beauty of my garden. Nature, whom I had encountered often in my wanderings, had always seemed my enemy, her only purpose to add to my discomfort. But today, I couldn't keep my eye off the peaks, the way the light slid and shimmered along them, turning them into different shades of gold. As the day grew older, there was a sharp sweetness to the air. I breathed it in great gulp, holding it until my lungs ached, and still I couldn't get enough. Did it smell like the incense Vyasa had once sprinkled on a fire to make it speak? I shook my head to clear it. I knew that the enter of the mountains could make one hallucinate. Already it was hard to advance, to lift my feet from the snow that sucked at them. Still I smelled the incense, and along with it I heard the chirping of birds, though we were too high up to encounter any. I called my husbands to ask if they had noticed anything. Only then did I realize that they'd gone far beyond me. Arjun was the farthest ahead, scouting the path for danger, closely followed by Nakul and Sahadev. But Bhim and Yudhishthir, conversing as they walked at a more leisurely pace, heard me and stopped. Bhim turned. He was coming to get me, but Yudhishthir put a forbidding hand on his arm. He was reminding him of the law. Once on the path, you couldn't retrace your steps, no matter what happened. Resentment flared through me. Rules were always more important to Yudhishthir than human pain or human love. I knew then that he alone would reach the gate of heaven, for among us only he was capable of shedding his humanity. I wanted to tell him this. One last outburst that he would remember even in heaven. But the bitter words dissolved in my mouth, the way the far peaks were dissolving into evening. What use, even if I was right? On the nearest mountain, the snow had turned the color of the lotus I'd once made Bhim pluck for me. I hoped he recognized it and rejoiced in what we'd been, the strongest man in the world, who, for the sake of love, rushed into danger, the woman born of fire, whose glance had the power to make him smolder with imprudence. It was a good memory on which to end a life. When I stepped from the path into the air, I heard my husband's cry out. As I fell behind me, there was confused commotion. Bhim, I guessed, was scuffling with Yudhishthir, trying to get past him to me. But Yudhishthir would win, as he always did. because Kunti, in her efforts to ensure their survival, had trained his younger brothers to obey him without question. Bhim was sobbing. Would the others weep when they heard? Surely, even the colorless Yudhishthir would shed tears. Hadn't I been by his side all these years, through good times and bad? But no. I could hear him murmuring consolation, reminding Bhim of their greater goal. It was both infuriating and mortifying. Perhaps that was why, when the thought came, I did not try to push it away. Karn would never have abandoned me thus. He would have stayed back and held my hand until we both perished. He would have happily given up heaven for my sake. I hadn't fallen far. Just a few arms' length below the trail jutted a lip of rock cushioned with snow. I landed there. My breath was knocked out of me, and my left arm was twisted under my body. But perhaps because of the cold, or because I deliberately chosen sermons, better to lie here in relative peace and gather my last thoughts. Perhaps the mountain air carried sounds farther than normal, or perhaps I imagined the words, for though they must have travelled even farther by now, I could hear Bhim and Yudhishthir talking. Why should she fall? Bhim asked, his voice rough with tears. Why shouldn't she walk any further? Was it because her woman's strength gave out? And Yudhishthir replied, in that dispassionate voice of his, no, Bhim. It's because although she had many good qualities, she had one major fault. As do each one of you, like her, you too, will fall when you reach the level beyond which that flaw can't proceed. Panchaali, Bhim exclaimed. I don't believe it. Why? She was the most devoted of wives. I smiled through numb lips at his words. Generous Bhim, who had forgotten the many times I had berated him, the many difficulties in which I had landed him. What fault could she have had? She married us all, but she loved one man more than everyone else. Who was it? I could hear the longing in Bhim's whisper. In that moment, if I could have chosen where love fell, I would have given it to Bhim. I consoled myself with this. At least I'd kept my feelings hidden from my husband's. I'd spared them the pain of knowing who it was that occupied my innermost thoughts through these years, whose admiration I'd longed for, whose taunts had hurt me the most, at whose death all colors were leached from my world. It was, Yudhishthir said, and then he paused. He knew the secrecy I'd prided myself on. He had seen through it, lost as he was in his own world of idols. I'd never credited him with much perceptions, but I'd misjudged him. My heart constricted as I waited to hear what he would reveal, what he would accuse of me. I was surprised to discover how tense I was. I'd been wrong in thinking I wanted nothing more from the world. Though I wouldn't see them again, my husband's final opinion suddenly mattered immensely to me. Yudhishthir let his words out in a rush. Arjun. It was Arjun. He cared most for him. He had spared me. He had chosen kindness over truth and uttered, for the sake of my reputation, the second lie of his lifetime. Thus, in my dying hour, Yudhishthir proved that he had loved me all along. In doing so, he left me at once grateful and ashamed for the many bitter words I directed at him, and those I had held festering inside. Bhim gave a resigned sigh. Can't really blame her, I suppose, he said. Him being a great warrior and so good looking too. Why even the celestial dancers at Indra's court couldn't resist him. How easy he was with his forgiveness where I was concerned. How magnanimous. I wished I could tell him how much I admired him. And my other husbands, too. Each had his strengths, his tenderness. Nakul with his jokes, Sahadev with his consideration. Arjun, who had never hesitated to stand between us and danger. When I'd had the chance to appreciate them, I'd spent it venting my dissatisfaction. Now it was too late. What are the flaws that will cause the rest of us to fall? Bhim asked. Sahadev's is pride in his learning, Nakul is vanity for his good looks, Arjun's is his warrior ego, and yours is your inability to control yourself when you are hungry. Yudhishthir spoke calmly as always, but this time I caught the sadness beneath. It was a lonely life he had led all these years, set apart even from those he loved most by his passion for righteousness. I'd been foolish to let it infuriate me, to wish that he would give up his stiff, silly principles. Righteousness was his nature. He couldn't give it up any more than a tiger can give up its stripes. And because of it, he would go on abandoning his dearest ones in the moment of their death, to the ultimate loneliness, to be the only human in the court of the gods. Hi, if you have listened to my audiobook this far, then it is for sure that you are the true listener of my audiobooks. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel and do press the bell icon to not forget any video in future. So till now, I'll be taking your leave, and enjoy this audiobook with all your friends and family. Share with everyone. Thank you.